Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As promised, we will start on time, hopefully finish on time. There's a reception at 5:30, so it gives us some time at the end to have a forum discussion, as there'll be a lot of interesting things talked about this afternoon. On health and safety, first of all, in case of a fire, which hopefully won't happen to us, we have 2 exit points on your right and on your left, and then please go out the main door and we congregate outside. But hopefully that won't happen to us, although it is Friday the 13th, so we keep our fingers crossed there. If you believe in that, I know that Darragh Breen didn't believe in that last night. Anyway, welcome to Leading for the Future. My name is Dermot O'Flynn. I'm the Director of Professional Development at the Institute of Leadership. And along with my colleagues here, we've organised this alumni parallel session, which I think you'll find interesting and invigorating. The plan for this afternoon is that we'll actually allow each speaker their session with a Q&A afterwards for them. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll have an open forum for them as well. John Brennan is our keynote speaker today, who unfortunately will have to leave us shortly afterwards, but he'll come back later on to join us at a later stage. John Brennan, who is currently the Chief Executive of Jury's Inn, where he was responsible for Group's 24 hotels in the UK, 7 in Ireland and 1 in Prague. Before he worked for Jury's, he spent 23 years with the famous Four Seasons chain, working in 7 different countries. And during that time, John worked his way up to the position of Regional Vice President, looking after Prague, Budapest and Dublin. John is probably best known in hotel sectors in Ireland as actually opening the Four Seasons in Ballsbridge and certainly raising the standards of service right through this country. Under John's guidance, Jury's Hotels has won a raft of awards: Best Independent Hotel Award, Best Brand in 2012 and 2010 at the Business Travel Awards, Best Irish Hotel Company in 2011, and became the UK's first green hotel group and recognised by the Green Tourism Business Scheme, and was awarded the very prestigious Gold Award for Investors in People in 2011. John is ranked in the UK as one of the most influential executives in the hospitality industry, and he's also a fellow of the Irish Institute of Hotel and Catering. John this afternoon is going to talk about leadership and service, and we welcome John back because he actually spoke earlier on in the year and there was such a good reaction that people said please bring him back and speak again. John Brennan, you're most welcome.
Good afternoon, thank you. What Dermot didn't tell you is that Dermot and I started our careers together in the hospitality industry, working in the kitchens of the Burlington Hotel, where we learnt everything that we could about the business. It's great to be back. Thanks for inviting me back. Obviously stuck for people to speak, so it's good to get another outing, and it's good actually to be here on the occasion of the gathering, which something that got a huge round of mixed publicity when it was first announced has been really a fantastic success for tourism, fantastic success for the country, and it's been a great initiative. And I'm struck, when I see everybody around the room here, how influential and how international the Royal College of Surgeons is. I had the pleasure of working in Malaysia for a number of years and having to bring my mother to a hospital in Malaysia, and the gentleman who was taking care of the doctor had been trained in the Royal College of Surgeons and actually knew people my mother knew, so a very, very funny thing. The medical world is obviously quite different than the hospitality world, but on the other hand, there are quite a lot of similarities. And I think there are probably more and more similarities coming into it all the time. I think there's probably 2 particular elements that are, maybe 3 particular elements that are sort of link them together. The first one is the whole area of service and delivering service. And by service, I don't just mean kind of the one-dimensional aspect of service, but the multi-dimensional aspect of service, the product and the service that you deliver. Secondly is the fact that the commerciality of the medical world is becoming an increasingly big challenge for everybody. Countries operating under the kind of debt burdens that they're currently operating under, fiscal restraints and constraints that they're operating under, plus the fact that obviously we have people living longer and having more requirement, and the medical field being able to give them that much more. So, managing budgets, managing businesses in the context of the medical world is probably becoming a hugely important challenge for everybody, and likely to become increasingly so as we see the amount of government budgets that are being spent on health, and some of the projections as to what those numbers could become in the years ahead if they continue to grow as they are. I've had a very diverse career. I've worked all over the world. and I've worked in every different kind of hotel, starting in the Doyle Group here in Dublin and working my way around, and now being back in Ireland as Chief Executive of Juries. In the time I have, I'm going to give you a few thoughts from my experiences, specifically as it relates to leadership and specifically as it relates to leadership in a service industry. When I think about leadership, and there's a nice quotation there from Dwight Eisenhower, which really talks about, what is leadership all about? The art of getting somebody to do something because they want to do it, not because they have to do it. And I suppose if I think about my experience over the years, from starting in literally in the bar in the Burlington Hotel, and working my way now to running a multinational company that has 2,000 employees and a turnover of 160 million pounds. I think about what are the things that sort of really kind of resonate with me about leadership and resonate about what makes a successful leader in the context of a service business. I think there are four things that really make the difference in terms of being a successful leader. The first one is about being close to the customers. I mean, close to the customers that you're targeting and the customers that you're dealing with. The second one is being close to the employees and understanding who's working with you, understanding who they are, what the skills they have, how they're being trained, how they're being developed. Thirdly, being close to the numbers. And in that context, I don't just mean the financial numbers, but the metrics that drive business performance in the context of the balanced scorecard. I also think that leaders demonstrate certain behaviors, and those certain behaviors that good leaders display are around being inquisitive, demonstrating hard work, being a good listener, having enthusiasm, and focus, and also having a passion for what they do. While I think all of these are pretty self-explanatory in the context of being a good leader, and particularly in the context of a service business, I'd like to explore for a minute just why I believe that each one of these areas are so important. I think when we look at the business, we talk about measuring things and looking at them, and we look at this concept of defining, measuring, analyzing, improving, and controlling. And we think about the numbers in the business and making sure that we're focused on how we're managing the business from a metric perspective. This actually factors through all of the areas that we're going to talk about. Pardon me. Sorry. If we think about the being close to the customers, why is it so important to be close to the customer? And in a service business, why is it so important to be close to the customer? Ultimately speaking, the business is all about the customers. And the customers decide if they're going to buy your product. They're going to decide if they actually will come back. And they're going to decide if they will recommend you to others. But critically, they're also going to determine at what price point they're willing to pay for your product. And what is a reasonable price point relative to the input costs that you have. So you can think about what that reasonable price point is from your own perspective. But ultimately speaking, it's going to take the customer's perspective in all of that. So I think being a successful leader in a service business requires being out there, talking to customers, understanding the perspective that they have of your business. We have surveys that we do with our guests on a regular basis. We get about 100,000 surveys a year. And within those surveys, we try to understand exactly about what do we do well and should continue to do and enhance, and what do we don't do so well, and how can we improve those things. I get out personally to meet customers on a frequent basis. And I'm often amazed in businesses, how little senior management actually engages with customers. How often, or lack thereof, do they actually go out and say, tell me about your experience of our business. Tell me about what we do well. Tell me about what we don't do so well, and let's see how we can make improvements in all of that. Being close to people, the employees, is the second part of the equation. And I think, if you think about service businesses and how you run a service business, I mean, Walt Disney said that you can dream, create, and build the most beautiful place in the world, but it takes people to make the dream a reality. And if you think about it from a perspective of customer service in the hospitality field, customer service involves two aspects. It involves the technical delivery of getting things right, and it also involves the hospitality. And I like to describe it to my employees as get it right and get me right. So get it right is making sure that you get the technical things right, and the hospitality is how you feel in the overall experience. And the other part that I often constantly remind myself of and constantly think about is that what drives compliment in a business and what drives complaint in a business. Complaints are generally speaking driven by technical things. They're mostly driven by the fact that breakfast was cold, check-in was incorrect, I got the details wrong. There's very few compliments that come from the technical. You don't often get a compliment from somebody saying, "Oh, that was a really good check-in," right? Very seldom. But what you do get a compliment about is the way the person who dealt with that individual made them feel. But the complaints that you get, if you get the technical wrong, can kill a business. Because you can only get so much space from a guest in terms of because your employees were friendly and nice, right? You have to deal with the technical. And I think in your business, obviously, that becomes hugely more critical than it is in ours. But it's the combination of the two that really makes great service. It's the combination of getting the technical right and getting the hospitality right. That obviously means that you have to hire the right people. You have to attract them. You have to retain them. You have to train them. You have to reward them. You have to recognize them in terms of being able to do that. Because it's those people at the front line who really are the difference between your business being successful or not. And I think that's particularly critical in the context of a hospitality business, that most of the interactions that our customers have with our employees are in an unsupervised environment. So, we run 24/7 businesses, employees up in guest rooms, cleaning rooms, or talking to guests in the corridor. There's not a supervisor or a manager there looking over their shoulder to see if they did a good job. So in effect, what we need to do is we need to hire people who have a strong behavioral orientation towards hospitality. We then have to train them for the skills that are required to do the job. And we have to ensure that they are motivated enough to want to do a good job. In terms of getting the numbers right, there's lots of KPIs that one can look at. But for us, we manage the business from the balanced scorecard perspective, as I think most businesses say they do. But I think it's very important that you actually do look at it in a holistic fashion. And I think good managers need to be comfortable with KPIs because, you need to use your gut in lots of things. You need to have your intuition. You need to be able to deploy that intuition when you're looking at things. On the other hand, the numbers don't lie, and the numbers tell their own stories. And you have to be able to judge your performance, to judge your strategy, to judge your tactics by virtue of whether you're delivering on the right KPIs. So the financial metrics, the market metrics, i.e. how you're performing against your competition, customer metrics that we talked about before in terms of not just the standard customer surveys that we do ourselves, but now today in the social media world, what does TripAdvisor say? What do all of these other things say? And I don't believe that there's such a thing as TripAdvisor for the medical profession, but social media is something that we got a piece of research the other day from a company called BDRC Continental in the UK. They surveyed 2,000 business and leisure customers in the UK. And 4 out of 5 of those people engage in social media. So, social media is just going to affect so much of what we do in so many areas, no matter what happens. So I think if a leader has those attributes, is focused on customers and employees, and focus on the metrics, they also have to have the ability to show agility and resilience, in the face of what's happening. And I think agility and resilience are things that have become even more important in the last number of years than they ever were before. But I think they've always been important in terms of leadership. The ability to be flexible depending upon what market conditions and what circumstances present themselves. Reality of it is we live in an ever-shifting and changing world that moves at a faster pace than it ever did before. And market conditions are constantly evolving, competitor conditions are constantly evolving. So the necessity to have agility is necessary, but also resilience. The ability to stick with it when things are tough. I think every business operating in Ireland has had to have that over the last couple of years. But I also think that even in normal circumstances, having a degree of resilience is absolutely important. I always like the Marine Corps' adage, adapt and improvise, because that certainly is what's necessary to be successful in the current market. One of the books that I like a lot, and that's Spencer Johnson's Who Moved My Cheese, and I know that he was an RCSI alumni as well. But in very simple terms, it sort of talks about the necessity to be agile, the necessity to be flexible, the necessity of adaptation. And I think, if anything, it's great to have the necessary educational background, necessary to have the precursors to be a good leader. That ability to adapt to the circumstances and the situation separates often the successful from the very successful in business. So I've identified, I suppose, 10 things that for me are important in terms of a business and leadership in a business and leadership in a service business as well. The first one that I've said is cash is like oxygen. The second one, setting a clear direction and letting it permeate all you do. The third one, culture is key. The fourth is people both create and destroy culture. Fifth is service and quality can deliver a sustainable commercial advantage. 6 is giving people the tools and the support to do the job. 7 is around communication. 8 is around being tough on performance but soft on people. 9 about taking decisions being more important than perfect decisions. And 10, if it goes wrong, the leader needs to fix it quickly and, if required, personally. And number 11, don't afraid to be asked to ask for advice. So just very briefly dealing with what each of these are and why they're important. Cash is like oxygen. I think one of the things that we've all learned over the last number of years is how important cash flow is to a business. And I suppose a little bit like the medical profession here in Ireland, I mean, you need cash to run the business. And I think if anything, businesses previously were very focused on P&Ls, very focused on what does the profit look like, not as focused on cash flow. The last number of years have really focused on that. And it's also, I think, focuses on taking decisions in our businesses, depending upon the circumstances that have existed, that somehow optimize cash flow and just allow us to operate in a manner that is conducive with that. And that requires making tough choices around prioritization or lack thereof of certain aspects of a business. Certainly over the last couple of years, particularly in 2008 and 2009, where the hotel business saw a precipitous drop in revenue, in Ireland by almost 50% from peak to trough, in the space of an 18-month window. We had to make a lot of decisions around cutting back on administrative costs, trying to ensure that we made the business as lean as possible, but at the same time protected frontline services from the perspective of customers and employees. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, in terms of the refrain? The second was about setting a clear direction and letting it permeate all you do. When I worked with Four Seasons, we had a goal, and our goal was to operate in every hotel that every country and every location that we operated in, the best hotel in every location. That was our goal. It was very clear, it was very simple, very easy to understand, and focused everybody's attention and direction in a certain way. In the case of Jury's Inns, we also have a goal, and our goal is to operate the most successful UK and Irish mid-market hotel company. So we're not aspiring to be another Four Seasons. We'd be bankrupt within days if that was the case. But we are focused on delivering something that has a very strong goal. We're also focused on outperforming our competitors. The hospitality industry gives you a lot of visibility of that. And so we say that we want to lead our competitors in terms of market performance as being one of our benchmark goals. The third thing is about culture. And I think culture is something that is hugely important in any business, and actually hugely important in life in general. And I think about, again, going back to my Four Seasons days and what made Four Seasons more successful than other companies in the last number of years. Certainly, Four Seasons went from being a tiny Canadian company to being a global leader in hospitality in the luxury field. And I think the thing that really made Four Seasons different was the culture. The culture for the people and from the people to the customers. And the chairman of the company, the founder of the company, Isidore Sharp, laid out his cultural goals and beliefs in a one-page document, who we are, what we believe, how we behave. But one of the key things about that was that, it wasn't just a piece of paper that was stuck on the back of a door or put in the manual. It was actually something that he really lived every day. He always sort of described it, employees needed to be treated well, fairly, they needed to have a good work environment where they worked, because they would then go and give better customer service to the customers. And it wasn't about having a manual that says, on this occasion you do that. It was about more the mindset of what would be the right thing to do. So putting the manual aside and actually doing the right thing built the culture of that particular organization. Very closely aligned to that is, people both create and destroy culture. And I suppose if you think about a business, having the right people, getting that esprit de corps, getting the people orientated in the same way, being mutually supportive and delivering on this aspiration is critical in any business, but no more so than in the hospitality field. Having people who are genuinely enthusiastic about coming to work, who are genuinely enthusiastic about giving great customer service is hugely important. Treating people in a certain way as managers, ensuring that they are being respected and taken care of and managed professionally is obviously the key thing too. Having said that, if you have people in the organization who don't believe in doing that, they're like a cancer in the organization and need to be removed. And that was one of the things that in Izzy's book, when he wrote about the history of Four Seasons, he talks about the fact that there were a number of really senior executives who were working for the company, had been working for the company for a number of years, but actually when he started really formalizing his culture and his beliefs about how people should be treated, they weren't people who bought into that. So they had to be removed from the business, because otherwise, I think it's in Built to Last, in the book, they talk about this concept of behavioral integrity, right? And this behavioral integrity really is about, there is a culture that you talk about, and there is actually what happens in the organization. If there's a disconnect between the two, there's no real culture. There's certainly not a culture that's clearly defined and one that's going to deliver results. Service and quality can deliver a sustainable commercial advantage. In our business, what drives rates, effectively, pricing, is service and quality. What differentiates Hotel A from Hotel B, from Hotel C, from Hotel D, is generally not about the physical elements. There is a certain amount of physical difference between the four hotels operating in the same market space. But in general, it's about the service and the quality that's delivered. If you do get the right level of service, and if you do get the right level of quality, and most critically, the consistency that's required, you can, generally speaking, charge more money for it. Research indicates that if you can improve your TripAdvisor score, from, let's say, 3 stars to 4 stars, you can charge a higher price. If you improve your score on the 5-point scale for a company like Booking.com by 1 point, you can improve your pricing by something up to 20% between the nearest competitor and yourself. So there is a sustainable commercial advantage to delivering on great service and great quality. And the thing about service and quality is it's timeless, as against a new physical building. You can build a new physical building, you can put all of the bells and whistles into it, but for sure, down the road in 12 months' time, will probably come another one. And it'll be newer, and it'll be better, because this is a constantly evolving thing, and customers' expectations are rising. But the thing that is timeless is that ability to deliver great service and great quality. Giving people the tools to do the job and supporting them. I mean, as leaders in the hospitality business, one of the things we have to do is we've got to give people the right tools and the right support to do the job. There's nothing more frustrating for an employee, and I'm sure it's the same in your business as it is in mine, nothing more frustrating than not having the right tools to do the job. Hearing that we're running out of stock of certain items on busy days, not having enough equipment, making sure that the managers and the leaders are listening and are on the front line and understanding what's happening on the front line and giving people the necessary tools and equipment to do the job. Now, that doesn't mean that you can give everybody everything, but if there's a real requirement, a piece of equipment that's constantly breaking down, an item of equipment that's constantly running short, then you have to be able to do that. And if you don't, my belief is that you lose credibility as a leader. You lose credibility from your employees. Communication is key, and I think operating over the last number of years, we've all learned how important communication is. I've been incredibly inspired by the employees over the last number of years in terms of the level of change that's been required, the level of adaptability that's been required, and how supportive employees have been of us as a company to do all of that. Going back again to 2008, 2009, when we were really in the eye of the storm, and unsure and uncertain as to whether we would survive as a business, quite frankly, with revenues dropping as precipitously as we did. We had to make lots of changes. And those changes, we spent an awful lot of time communicating with the employees, an awful lot of time getting not just their buy-in, but their input into the changes that we were making. But once we did that, we found that they were hugely supportive of the changes that we made. And frankly, the business is far more successful today as a result of that, now that revenue is returning. Tough on performance, soft on people. I believe very strongly that, again, going back to culture, the environment of your company needs to be supportive of your people. It needs to recognize that people have personal circumstances, personal situations, and we need to be supportive of that. On the other hand, I think businesses need to have a very, very strong performance culture, and they need to be orientated towards results. And it's not acceptable if consistently results are not being achieved. But that doesn't mean that you need to be rude, aggressive, have inappropriate behavior in terms of the way you handle things. But it's about making sure that you can show that sort of tough love if necessary, the ability to support people on one hand, but the ability to drive performance on the other hand. Taking decisions being more important than perfect decisions. I mean, particularly in today's world, we've got so much data about everything that we do. It's literally thousands and thousands of gigabytes of data. The trick is to try and find what's the most important data. What's the most important data that you need to make a decision, but not wait to have all the necessary information. Because you're never going to have all the necessary information, and if you wait until you have all the necessary information, it's going to be too late, and your competitors will have already eclipsed you. If it goes wrong, fix it quickly, and personally if required. Again, I think this is a question of leadership. If things go wrong, which they will do, and frankly, one has to stick your hand up and say, there's a problem, we need to recognize it. But you need to then also get it fixed quickly. And I think if the issue is serious enough, then the more senior leaders need to be personally involved in getting it fixed. It's not just simply good enough to sit in your office when you have a massive service problem in one of your hotels. You need to be willing to take the necessary steps, get hands-on, and fix the problem quickly. And don't be afraid to ask for advice. It's probably number 11 because it's the one that I learned last in my career. It took me an awful long time to figure that out. I think it's a question of asking for advice. It's also a question of making sure that if there are challenges and if there are problems, that you're willing to confront them quickly. So, I often talk about, with my guys, I say, give me the bad news sooner rather than later. I don't want to wait until it's too late. Because if you tell me about it, we can probably do something about it. Because invariably, all this stuff always comes out. It's like with my board, I'm always very careful that if there is a potential issue that's bubbling away that could become a problem, well, let's tell them about it sooner rather than later, just so that you're not hiding things. And ask for advice. Ask for advice from the people who can give you the advice. Professionals, people of expertise, peers, and actually more senior people. Just before I came in here, I was on the telephone to my chairman, actually. We have a board meeting next week, and a slightly contentious issue popped up. And my chairman was talking to me about how how he suggests I navigate it. And frankly, because of his level of expertise and experience, he was able to bring great advice to that particular situation. So, in conclusion, all of the above that we've talked about needs to be set in the context. Set in the context of being close to people, close to customers, close to the numbers, and having the agility and the resilience to deal with the circumstance that present themselves to you given the market conditions. And a last little quotation that I leave you with is one from Colin Powell, the general. It talks about optimism, perpetual optimism, being something that really kind of is in and of itself a great strength, because it helps to get everybody fired up and achieve things. And for me, I think the glass is always half full rather than half empty, because if you think it's half empty, it will always be half empty. That doesn't mean that you have to ignore issues or be put as I think the Americans often have the expression, putting lipstick on a pig, right? The reality of it is, the reality of it is you can't do that. But you know what? There is a way to look at things with a more positive view of life than a more negative view of life. In a short period of time, that's all I have time for.
Before we let John go back to the general phase of the industry, are there any few questions, questions? Any other questions for John? In relation to what you say about the service industry, about culture?
I have a question. So the point is about you need to develop agility and resilience. So how do you actually, if you are a leader or aspiring to be a leader, how do you actually tangibly go about doing that? Resilience, I suppose, comes with good personal character. In terms of developing skills to be agile, what's specific?
I think one of the things that you do is you put yourself into a variety of situations, that you actually take on things that are, by definition, different perhaps than what you did before. And certainly in my career, that was one of the things that was done for me, I suppose, or I was encouraged to do, was to move a lot within geographies, move a lot in terms of the scale of properties that I was working in, move a lot in terms of the kinds of people that I was working with, move a lot in terms of the commercial challenges that existed. So rather than necessarily staying in a particular position where things were all good, actually encouraged to take on additional responsibilities and do different things. But that could also be just take on projects, take on projects in areas and skill sets that you're not as fully developed in. And we do a lot of that with our employees, for example. So we have an aspiring managers group, or actually we call them the high potential group, who are going to be the next wave of general managers in the hotels. And we actually do a lot of psychometric testing with them, and an awful lot of profiling, and an awful lot of actual discussions with them around where they feel their strengths or their issues of development will be. And we actually create experiential learning circumstances for them through projects and temporary assignments that helps them to deal with that. Now, the key thing, I think, is that you need to do that with the support and the guidance and the coaching of somebody who perhaps is an expert in that area. So what you don't want to do is to throw somebody in at the deep end and say, you need to know that, so go off and do it, right? And you'll be successful if you succeed, and you won't be successful if you don't. That used to be the old way of doing it, right? So it's the old sink or swim kind of way. I think this is more controlled, and certainly we believe we give people coaches and mentors relative to this kind of stuff, so that we can help them to become more agile relative to what they're doing.
Take one more question, yes, please.
I'm just curious then as to what percentage of your budget you invest in your people to service your customers.
Well,
Because I'm listening to you.
labor cost is by far the largest cost in our business, that would be the same, I think, of every hotel company. There's no cost that would be higher than that. I think then there is the sort of the formal cost that is deployed, let's say, to support all of that. So the running of the human resources department, the running of the learning and development department, and all of the training courses that you run, and all of the various other things. And those costs actually, in the context of the overall business, are probably not that large. They run to maybe less than £1 million a year, let's say, in our business, right? But the time that we devote to it runs to a very high percentage of the time that we're doing. So it's not just about the operating expenses. It's really around every management meeting. Is that on the agenda? What do you do when you go to the hotels? How do we work with people in the hotels? And that, people is probably 50% of the time that all of the senior management people deploy on things, if not more, quite frankly. And that's really where the big investment comes, is from that, rather than from necessarily running training courses or having consultants, running around the business, which we're not, and I'm not personally a huge fan of, but we do that from time to time.
Let's say on behalf of all of us here, can I thank John for taking some time out this afternoon? He has to go back to a busy meeting in about 20 minutes' time.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to say thank you very much
Thanks.
for joining us this afternoon. He may get a chance to go back to the forum at the end, or he might join us for a drink later.
Great, thank you.
Safe journey. Thank you very much indeed. Now, to move to a different space that the Institute of Leadership has started to get involved in. I'm delighted to welcome Mary Aiken. Mary is now the director of the new RCSI Cyberpsychology Research Centre, and is a cyberpsychologist herself and a research fellow here at the Institute of Leadership at the RCSI. Mary's research currently is focusing on the virtual profiling and cyber behaviour analysis, which is going to explain something about this to us. She's currently leading a very important international research project in conjunction with Interpol. And Mary also recently co-led a White House research team focused on technology, facilitated human trafficking and isomorphic problems. We're delighted to welcome Mary, because she's one of our colleagues as well. And I have to remind all the next speakers, we're running about 10 minutes per speaker now, and 5 minutes for question and answers. Mary, you're most welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is a clicker?
The next one there.
This is the forward one. Thanks, Dermot. Dermot delivered that with conviction. Isomorphic problem solving. So my name is Mary. As Dermot says, I'm a cyberpsychologist and research fellow at the Royal College of Surgeons. So just want to, at the Institute of Leadership, wanted to welcome everybody to the gathering. We have a big delegation in from Jordan. So marhaba, assalamu alaikum, yihalla, نبحب الأردن. مساء النور بعدين. So basically, the presentation I'm going to take you through, because I work with police and I work with police intelligence, there's a limit to how much I can discuss in a public forum, especially when I'm being recorded. So just bear with me. I'd like to give you a flavour of what my research is about. The Cyberpsychology Research Centre that Dermot referred to will be opening on the 4th of October. So we'll be doing more detailed analysis of our future work at the centre. If you want to come to that event, you can talk to me afterwards. So basically, what is cyberpsychology? It's an emerging field within applied psychology. We study the impact of technology on human behaviour. The focus is on internet psychology, but the internet is becoming less relevant. We won't be talking about the internet in 5 years' time, we'll just be talking about technology, because a lot of activity is happening offline, so to speak, in terms of device-to-device communication. But we also look at other technologies, virtual environments, artificial intelligence, gaming, digital convergence, mobile telephones, and networking devices. So I like this clip. People think that online offenders are the only people who actually get together and syndicate online. I found this company who are actually offering training, warning about the dangers of psychopathy online. But there's some element of truth in it, in that what we see is in every sort of abnormal psychology or deviant group, there tends to be some sort of virtual forum online to support them. And that's interesting when we think about it in terms of everything that we know in terms of researching as psychologists is based on real-world metrics. But if you now take the law of proximity and domain out of the equation and look at people syndicating to find each other online, I think going forward we're going to see different incidences in the general population of specific conditions. But that's something we'll be looking at in the research centre. So we've seen an explosion in information technologies. Of course, you've got to look at all the positive aspects of technology. We are essentially, at our research centre, we're pro-technology, but certainly there are risks. Our research area, we look at cyberbullying, online sex offending, and technology-facilitated human trafficking. So there's a lot of interest in cyberspace at the moment. And psychologists in particular are interested in this area: cognitive, social, educational, organizational, clinical, and experimental psychologists. We find that there's increasingly an interest in this area. The big question, I suppose, in terms of the psychology of cyberspace is that will traditional, real-world psychological concepts and theories be sufficient to actually look at investigation in this area? Will we need to modify existing theories, or will we need to develop new ones? So in my own research area, I look at youth behavioural escalation online. The last thing that I'm going to do is sit down in a real-world focus group and talk to minors with permission of their parents, because how close are you going to get to the truth? So really, what you want to do is look at virtual research methodologies. Of course, you have to, from an ethics point of view, have permissions in place, but really what you want to see is you want the participant that you're studying actually immersed in the environment and then closer to actually manifesting some of the behaviours that they would manifest in that environment. So arguably, knowledge from traditional psychology may not be sufficient. Apology to any psychologists in the room, but this is a question of a constant process of education. We need to broaden scientific investigation, and as scholars join together in crystallizing new ideas and conquering this very new and very exciting research frontier. So I'm tight on time here, and Dermot will be on my case if I go over, so excuse me if I go a little fast, but I just want to touch on a couple of different areas. In terms of sort of real-world and virtual behaviours, what we see is very different types of behaviours manifesting in cyber environments. And state and trait characteristics associated with those behaviours. So there's a whole body of research in cyberpsychology that looks at actually isolating these variables and understanding them. So anonymity, we're all familiar with that. Altruism, positive aspect of online behaviour. Online disinhibition effect, Professor John Suller, great researcher in this area, and I'd recommend anybody who's interested in online disinhibition to look at his papers, 2004 paper. Self-presentation online. This is a very interesting argument in terms of, when we talk about studying youth in this area, very often, and it's interesting, comes up in focus groups, that youth will say that the person they are in the real world, they're somebody different online. So you've got this incredibly carefully managed persona online. The person who has loads of friends, is always doing exciting things, is always going out. That person who sits at home and nobody's talking to or hasn't washed their hair or wearing their makeup, you don't see that person projected online. And that ties back into cyberbullying. If, from a youth perspective, that is the optimum person you can be this online presence, and that presence is attacked, then how devastating might that be? And is that then associated with some of the, consequences that we see in terms of extreme cyberbullying? So we talked about cyber presence, cyber immersion, intermittent reinforcement, aspects of technology, internet privacy, paradox. Again, any of these premises, you can look them up, or you can come to our session on the 4th, and actually we'll have a greater treatment of them. And then internet use disorder, IUD, as designated by DSM. So they didn't accept internet addiction. I think a lack of biological evidence for the condition was one of the primary reasons behind that. So now we've got internet use disorder. So I want to talk just a little bit about IA, not AI. AI is artificial intelligence. IA is intelligence amplification. So one of the great thinkers in the area of cyberpsychology, a professor called Licklider, in 1960 wrote a brilliant paper, and it was called Man-Computer Symbiosis. And he talked about the symbiotic relationship between man and machine. And this essentially is the essence of cyberpsychology, the technology and humans coming together. We constantly need to consider, in terms of dealing with technology, what we call factoring in the human. And I say that from a technology perspective, because if you think about the type of people who are actually designing technology, very much it's about what technology can do and introducing programs or applications just because you can, without really thinking about the behavioral implications of that. I was at the Microsoft research faculty seminar last year, and a great speaker stood up and she spoke about the absolute lack of females, paucity of females working in the area of technology, and what a pity this is. And she pointed out that from a female perspective, we've worked so hard for real world freedoms and liberation that we're going to end up populating a world almost entirely designed by men. So in terms of usability interface design, we need to think about, think about technology, basically it's designed to be rewarding, engaging and seductive for normal populations. Did anybody really think about deviant, abnormal and vulnerable population and the impact of aspects of technology on those underlying conditions? But the point about technology, it in itself is not good or bad. It simply mediates human behavior. We have to think of technology as a tool. However, from a behavioral perspective, what we do see is that wherever technology impacts on an underlying condition, we tend to see the behavior amplified and accelerated online, just from a pure forensic perspective. So, in terms of virtual behavioral profiling, what do we do? It's quite similar to forensic science in a real-world context. Forensic science is the physical behavior at a crime scene. Forensic psychology focuses on forensic science is the physical evidence at a crime scene. Forensic psychology deals with the behavioral evidence at a crime scene, what we call the blood spatter of the mind. My area, which is forensic cyberpsychology, looks at behavior manifested in a virtual context. So effectively, we look at tracing behavior, and this is all centers on criminal activity. One thing to remember is that Locard's exchange principle is the basic premise of forensic science, and it dictates that every contact leaves a trace. So I've been standing at the podium here, my fingerprints are here. So you can see that I was actually in the room standing here. And the same thing happens online. Every contact leaves a trace. The problem is, to John's point earlier, there's just too much data. So everything is available, but how do you find the relevant data? So this is a model in terms of actually looking at offending online. So you've victim, motive, you've characteristics of the criminal, you have their MO, how do they like to operate, you look at the digital forensic evidence, and out of that you make a deductive cyber profile. I just want to touch on the White House project, and again, it's restricted in terms of what I can discuss publicly, but the White House did a call for proposals in this area, and it's a testament to our education system here that Ireland is a centre of excellence in cyberpsychology. We have undergraduate programs, we have master's programs, and we have doctoral programs. And this is now recognised, you know, on a global scale. And when the White House were looking at this area, they came all the way to Ireland to pick a cyberpsychologist from Ireland to go and work on their academic team. And it was an incredible experience working on the team. I worked with network scientists from MIT and Harvard, and it was a great combination of, you know, cyberpsychology-based analytic skills coming in contact with network science analytic skills. So one of the things we did, how am I doing for time? Okay. Sorry, I'm so sorry. 1 minute. One of the things that we did was we were looking at evidence for human trafficking and looking at technology facilitated human trafficking. So in the US, domestic human trafficking is a big problem, and that's effectively young girls, you know, back in the day, your disillusioned 14-year-old from Ohio jumped on a train and went to Central Station and effectively was recruited or not into sort of, you know, various activities by the people who hung around there. Now we see vulnerable population being recruited online. So a young person expressing vulnerability like, I hate my family, I hate my parents, or actually, you know, posting promiscuous or indecent images online can actually be picked up by these what we call sophisticated cyber actors, who then befriend them, build a relationship, and may recruit them into basically criminal activity. So in terms of human trafficking, you have legitimate, well, almost legitimate online classified websites that are used for placing escort ads. So adults over 18 offering various escort services. And it has been established that these online classified sites are also used to traffic minors. So effectively, we started looking at it from a big data point of view and looking at the images. There's a fantastic research archive available through the Wayback Machine, which was an initiative of actually archiving contemporary data so that it wouldn't be lost. It was a US Senate initiative, and it provides a very rich corpus for longitudinal data. So effectively here on the screen, you can see a timeline there. So from 2004 to 2014, this is one particular website. I'm not going to give you the name of the website, but it's a website, and you can see the blue circles are the scrapable data, where the archive went in and captured all that data from that period. The average number of postings on online classified websites, for escorts in particular, are about 20,000 a day. So you can do the numbers to think about looking at these images basically over time. What we did was we constructed algorithmic and heuristical an algorithmic and heuristical approach to actually analysing the data, looking at the images, and looking for what we call detectable morphology within the images. So this was done as a test to basically see, could we detect morphologies within the images, and we found out that we could. The next project that we'll be looking at will actually be looking at human trafficking around the Super Bowl, and then refining the measure that we're using and actually looking at analysing images in and around that. So in the particular study that we did and we were presenting for the White House, we were looking for detectable morphology in and around velocity, volume, and the variety of this data. And these were effectively hotspots that we picked up. They were also, turns out, the swing states in terms of government elections. We're like, okay. So we haven't actually, we're analysing that. So just to wrap up, I work with Interpol, I work with the Met, with the Australian Federal Police, and with LAPD, and our primary concern is the protection of children online. NECMEC, which is the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, has a database of 90 million images that require investigation, and these are minors and these are criminal, these are crime scenes, effectively, each one of these images. And they have classified and analysed 5,133 of them. And that's why we need to focus on this area and look at machine intelligence, robust decision engineering to amplify effort, or else we are never going to get on top of the problem. So we want to look at applying analytics in terms of virtual behaviour profiling of actors. We call actors, it doesn't mean Hollywood actor, it's a network science depiction of a person in cyberspace. We want to look at degrading, perturbing and observing. We want to look at digital deterrence protocols, in other words, to actually deter people, criminals, from engaging in this activity, and you need machine intelligence to do that. And also we want to look at digital outreach to victims in this space. Again, machine intelligence is useful there. We want to look at predicting future trending. If you are dealing with problems at the moment, there's a great metaphor in network science where they talk about big data and looking at technology. And they make a comparison to crossing a dual carriageway, to crossing a major road. And they say that when you're looking at real-time data, and you capture it and then you analyze it after the fact, the equivalent is taking a photograph of traffic on a highway, putting the photograph in your pocket, and then actually crossing the road based on the photograph that you took 10 minutes ago, and presuming that there's not going to be any traffic. Because there's no point in looking at the data after the fact. So as scientists, we have to consider how we're going to get not only on the data in terms of a contemporary context, a temporal context, but also ahead of the data in terms of predicting future evolutions. We want to disseminate this intelligence to law enforcement in the appropriate jurisdictions. And we want to use big data to move towards making big decisions via big insights. And Meyenberger has a great premise that he's writing about at the moment, where he talks about moving towards the spirit of N equals all. And again, as researchers and scientists, sampling is a Victorian construct, basically. And it was conceptualized because of the impossibility of looking at all the data simultaneously. So we are now, with technology, looking at N equals all. Although the network science guys tell me, well, it's actually N equals all minus 1 multiplied by. So I said, okay, fair enough. As a premise, we'll go with N equals all. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
I think those of us who are working in the leadership have a really whole learning journey to go with. Shortly. I just think two questions, please, from Mary before we move on to the next speaker. Are there any questions, Mary? Yes.
Thanks very much, Mary. Mary, I was interested in your comment there on technology that accelerate and amplify psychological conditions.
Yes.
That's what you meant, isn't it?
Pardon?
That's what you meant, wasn't it? That's
Yeah.
technology. Yeah. Just trying to make sure I got that right. But I was wondering, is that something you think that you can do prospectively, say, in terms of testing people? Like, I'm involved now with a lot of training and things like that, so I'm just wondering, is that something that you wanted to amplify it, you can then try and detect it quicker, and then you can get people back into feedback and let them look at that.
I think that you amplify the base condition. So, in terms of, say, cyber stalking, cyberchondria, we see technology amplifies it, and that would be due to certain conditions online, like online disinhibition. So if you're talking about psychometric testing for employees, will you see an amplification if you test them in a virtual context? Yes, you will. So I think it's an interesting question, because if you are hiring people who are going to be working in a virtual context, how do you judge them in that environment? So if you're applying real-world metrics to them and you're not getting any red flags or everything looks good, that might be fine as long as they're working in a real-world environment. But what happens when they go online? And, to your point, if they are people who are going to be heavily involved in an area that is virtual, I think that it would be interesting to actually look at virtual research methodology to actually test them in a virtual environment as well, and have a period where they get immersed, where they get comfortable, and then where you look at testing and see, what's their virtual personality, and how does that manifest, and how do they react? And in fact, this is something that, in terms of our centre, has just been ratified by the EU for their cybersecurity initiative, and the EU are looking at leadership in a cyber context. They're looking to the military in a cyber context, and they're looking at we know how personnel may react in a real world environment, but how do they react in cyber on cyber occasions?
Thanks very much. Is there one more question for Mary before we move on? I'll give it for the four. Mary, can I thank you very much for your enthusiasm? Now, moving on, our next speaker is Mr. Michael Comyn. And Michael is the founder of the Fearless organisation, formed for the purpose of really removing stress from everyday situations and generating a stronger value of work and life balance. He also has a very highly successful company called the Fly Fearless Seminar, which over the last 2 years has educated over 1,800 participants on managing anxiety before they actually fly. He's been very involved with us as an associate faculty to our professional development unit and has helped develop resilience, stress management skills among young SHOs and registrars with the College of Physicians, with the College of Anaesthetists and with the College of Psychiatry. I'm delighted to welcome Michael this afternoon. He links very nicely with John Brennan's talk in saying agility and resilience are very, very important, and Michael now is going to talk about that important area. How do we develop resilience as people working today? Michael, you're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Dermot. And I'm going to try and do it to the clock as well, see how we fare with it. It's an interesting subject when you come to this whole area of resilience. So I'm going to start very quickly with a definition, and this will be the workable definition I want to use today. So you'll hear a lot of use of the word resilience. People are using it now. Last year it was going forward. Everything was going forward. This year it's resilience. We've got to be more resilient in what we do. The definition I want to use is your ability to absorb high levels of disruptive change, to bounce back and even excel in times of change and uncertainty without acting in dysfunctional ways. So the dysfunctional ways become really important to what we're looking at. So let me give you a little back history to resilience. It's been around for quite a while. The first work was done by psychologists associated with the US military who visited Buchenwald, Auschwitz and Dachau on the liberation of the concentration camps. And what they did was they followed people who had been through the concentration camp system to see how they fared, particularly those that had been survivors, using that word loosely, within the system. They also then took the research further, and they looked at young people who'd been through the projects of Detroit, and they also looked at people who'd been prisoners of war in the Japanese-Chinese War. The interesting thing was, and I'm going to give you the short version of this, which we could expound on, was they were looking for personality characteristics of resilient individuals. Did they find any? Any guesses? No. Particularly when it comes to the one they were looking for, which is in itself a dangerous idea. They were looking for optimism, and the optimists were the ones that, well, they suffered the worst because they kept thinking, today I'm going to get out, today someone's going to rescue me, this is going to be the day. The people who were defined as being the ultimate and most resilient were those who had incredibly strong reality testing skills. These were the people who looked around them and said, this is not a good situation. What am I going to do? Who's the guard I can bribe? Who's the strongest individual I should ally myself to? And this became the long-term definition for me in terms of the resilient individual, is the person who has an incredibly strong emotional intelligence, and within that emotional intelligence they have one shining example, and that is the ability to test the reality of the situation they are in. They remain in the centre. You'll hear a lot of talk about mindfulness, etc., but without even going near that word for a minute, the resilient individual looks about what is happening at this very moment and the resources they have at this very moment, rather than spending a great deal of time in fear of the past or anxiety of the future. Oops, there you go. That's what happens when you give your slides over to somebody else. The resilient individual, therefore, looks like this. In the centre, we're talking about the person being resilient, and they have a number of characteristics. We're looking at hardiness. So they have a physical hardiness. They look after themselves. They have good sleep hygiene. They have a good reasonable practice in terms of nutrition and exercise. And they practice some form of intervention, of meditation, or some form of breathing. That results in adaptability, innovation, the ability to bounce back, and they tend to show characteristics of creativity. Let's go back a step. There's a huge confusion around the word resilience and stress. What basically happened was training organisations a number of years ago wanted to run stress management courses, but no one would go on them. Because to admit that you were going on a stress management program was to admit failure and that you were in some way needed assistance. So the HR people renamed the stress management courses resilience courses. And so now it was cool to go on a resilience course because this person was going to help you in terms of managing your stress. Problem is, a lot of the people running these courses were still using this stuff. And you recognise the lion, and probably you'll also recognise the model of fight or flight. Remember that one? That's Dr. Walter Cannon. He was a US physician, 1916, in Harvard, and he was paid by the US military to have a look at this whole area of stress response. They were looking at the time, shell shock. And he came with this very handy notion of fight or flight. And what a lot of people forget to teach, it's not taught as well anymore, was he actually came up with 4 variants of this, which was fight, flight, freeze, and fragment. And the freeze and fragment have been kind of forgotten. You don't hear them because they don't really fit in with the theory of evolution. Because these people who either froze or fragmented got eaten, apparently. You take it forward a little bit, and we're doing some more, there's more interesting stuff going on. I would, for example, recommend, if you want to have a quick look at this topic, a really good text from Robert Sapolsky. It's called Why Zebras, whichever you prefer, Don't Get Ulcers. And he spent a great deal of time looking at the animal kingdom. And the interesting thing about the zebra and the lion that we've just talked about is that if that zebra is chased by a lion and survives, it recovers in about 6 minutes. There's no I've been chased by a lion support group. There's no intervention. And the zebra is very happy and very quick to go back to where it was grazing with a certain amount of startle response available to them. Sadly, and too, if the one zebra was to lose the foal or lose the partner in an attack, they will show a certain amount of distress for a period of time, but then they recover from it. And what Sapolsky's looking at, and what's interesting there is the connection between that amygdala response that we have when we get a fright or we get a startle, and the prefrontal cortex, which rationalizes the process, or in the case of the animal here, because it isn't so profound, doesn't spend a great deal of time on self-dialogue, which the rest of us do. So we can find that instead of the Serengeti or the savannas of Africa, this is our jungle now, and that our stress responses in many cases are not being triggered by what's physically happening to us, but our interpretation of it. The resilient individual is well able to handle that situation. Okay, so we don't have lions chasing us anymore, but the top 5 amygdala triggers now are condescension and lack of respect, being treated unfairly, being unappreciated, feeling you're not listened to or heard, or being held to unrealistic deadlines. Sound like where you work? Well, there you go. So we're not, as I said, anymore being chased by the lions and tigers, but these are the things that are causing the amygdala, or indeed, if you like, the threat to resilience of the individual. Richard Davidson in UCLA has this model which is really nice. It's a spectrum of resilience. He says there are 30 points on this from left to right. On the left-hand side, we have the person who is slow to recover. On the right-hand side, the person who's fast to recover. Oops, hey, there you go. That's me too. And in the middle of it all, he says the person on this side has a weaker left prefrontal cortex, and the person on this side has a stronger left prefrontal cortex. And somewhere in between is where we really need to be, so that there's an optimum level of resilience. Without going into it in too much detail, with 3 minutes to go on the thing, is what I would say to you is there's lots of work has been done on the left side, the slow to recover individual. What do we do to harden this person up a little bit to make them more resilient? And there are lots of interventions, whether it's good sleep hygiene, whether it's some form of meditation, or whether it's even practicing proper mindfulness, we'll actually do that as well. There's very little work and research to be found on what you do with the people on the other extreme. The people who are fast to recover, on the extreme scale of Davidson's spectrum, have one huge problem, is they've got no empathy at all. They have absolutely no ability. Without being psychopathic or sociopathic, they have the ability to shut down a factory and go and have some tea, if they need to. I have a client in that space at the moment. So that's fairly well underexplored in terms of what we're doing about it. So what I was going to do is get you to run a very quick self-check on your resilience. Again, this is a standard list that is used in terms of testing people's resilience. Number 1, are you optimizing your health and well-being on a daily basis? I was working with some younger doctors today, and I asked them all to declare what their hobby was. You raise your hands if you have a pastime or hobby. They all put up their hands. I said, how many of you have practiced in the last 6 days? They all took their hands down. So it has to be a real one, not an aspirational one. It's not like tennis on your CV. You know, everyone puts that down on the resume. We all play tennis. Have you enhanced your reality testing skills? A very quick sideline. I know we've got people visiting from abroad as well, but this is just a handy metaphor that comes to mind. We have a radio program here in Ireland called Liveline, where people ring up every day and they whinge and moan and complain, and life is generally miserable and awful. Well, there's a deputy or stand-in presenter there at the moment who is a superb guy, and what he does is he slowly, piece by piece, takes apart their whinge until there's nothing left. They didn't think he was going to last 3 days, but he's actually made a really good job of it. It's a superb skill. And I always recommend it to clients as well. Spend 1 whole week testing the veracity and the reality of everything that is said to you. You'll lose friends very quickly because you won't gossip anymore. You'll also won't carry tales further. And you'll find people find it really difficult to talk to you because you're constantly looking for actual data. Have a robust self-esteem, self-confidence and self-concept. I was at a conference recently, and one of the previous speaker in front of me did a superb presentation. She was incredibly good. She sat back down where I was sitting over there and beside me. Her boss leaned over, another woman, put her hand on her arm and said, "You'll do better next time." And in seconds, this wonderful, self-confident individual collapsed. You could see her just, whoof. Now the resilient individual would have said, "I wonder what's her problem." But you see, that's what we need to look, and that's what you're engendering, by the way, if you're trying to develop an individual's resilience as well. Self-confidence, self-concept, they work out fairly well. You need to have deliberate personal resiliency skills. You can't be aspirational about this subject. If you say you're going to meditate, you need to do the meditation. If you say you're going to exercise, you need to do it. And that's very often where a good coach will come into it. And the last part there is, have you room for serendipity, spontaneity, and serenity? I'll do these really quickly. I test for these with clients. Serendipity, that is the chance happenstance. It's me on a flight recently coming from Seattle, and as I settled into my seat, I'd been given an upgrade because it was my 11th time being there, and I settled into my seat. Next guy comes along, puts his bag in the overhead locker and says, "By the way, I won't be talking to you for the duration of this flight." Okay. So quick as a flash, and I often thank Oscar Wilde and previous Irishmen before me for saying, I turned to him and said, "Don't worry, I'd made the same decision about you." He spent the rest of the flight talking to me. And here's the pièce de résistance. I'm speaking at his company's conference in Luxembourg this Saturday. That's serendipity. Now, serendipity and the resilient individual is about remaining open to whatever's coming at you so that your system doesn't go into defensive mode and you lose out on the opportunity. Spontaneity. I'll always ask a client, between now and the next time I do a session with you, I want you to do something spontaneous. One guy opened his diary, said, "Well, I can do something next Thursday at 3:30. And that's for real. And the last one is serenity. Turn off the radio. Turn off the audio. And it's a great test for an individual whose resilience is under pressure, is that ultimately they cannot stand silence. Watch for these ones. I'm going to do these very quickly. It's catastrophic thinking, probability overestimation. Anyone recognize those? They're all from cognitive behavioral therapy. Look out for them as well. Intolerance of uncertainty, need for control, and mind reading are signs of the individual whose resilience is compromised. Here's my last slide. I'm going to ask you to think about doing a few of these things for yourself. Start making some connections. Avoid seeing crises as insurmountable. Accept that change is a part of living. Move towards your goals. Take decisive action. Look for opportunities for self-discovery. Nurture a positive view of yourself. No one else will. Keep things in perspective and maintain a hopeful outlook and take care of yourself. And there's one missing off that because it came from a presentation I did this morning. Reintroduce rituals into your life. They are phenomenally important for the resilient individual. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the express version.
Before we move on to our last two speakers. Any questions? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for that. Do you think, as doctors, we're becoming less resilient as time goes by?
I could give you two answers to that one. Maybe you never were. Is a possibility because the process or the model for resilience wasn't there. They might say that the hardy survived rather than the resilient. And the shorter version of it is there are things that will compromise resilience. They are the amygdala triggers I said to you earlier on, condescension, lack of respect, and possibly doctors heretofore had more of that respect and more perception of that supported them in the system. I was talking to a doctor today who was abused by a nurse, in a situation, and felt her resilience was compromised by that. She might have been protected from that 20 years ago. So, yes, I believe the circumstances have changed a little bit.
Thank you. Any other questions from Michael? Yes, sorry.
Hi.
Thank you, that was a fascinating presentation. I was just curious about your first slide and your definition of resilience, which basically referred to change as being the major stressor.
Yes.
You didn't mention stress in itself, and I would consider a lot of people suffer from stress-related problems because of the lack of change in their lives and the daily grind, and that is grinds and
Yeah.
times. And I just would you like to elaborate?
Thank you, I will do, and it just brings me back to Hans Selye, who I mentioned earlier on. He gave us a curve of stress, which I tend to forget, is that the stress that I tend to get involved in is the corporate stuff, which is at the peak, but he also identified that under-stimulation results in the same stress symptoms as overstimulation. He called it brownout and burnout, so rust out and burnout. So you're right, there is a stress which is there from the person. What you'll tend to find is that person operates at a slightly different level. There are 3 levels of engagement for anxiety. The first one is a group of society. This is Robert Keegan in Harvard's work. He says that there's a group of the population is socialized. About 50% of the population need, for example, social acceptability to fit in, to belong. The junior doctors I was working with today, that middle level, are self-authored individuals. They're starting to write their own life story, their own book. Their big stress is not from fitting in and belonging, it's from the fact that they operate to incredibly high standards for themselves. And then there's a fine little group, it's about 7% of the population, self-transformed individual. As far as they're concerned, they can hold contradictory impressions and they don't get stressed about it. So if you look at the individual who tends to be rusted out, they tend to be in that socialized group. No, sorry, complicated answer, but I hope it gave it to you.
One last question, are we okay? We might keep it the end as before.
Yeah.
Michael, again, thank you.
Pleasure, thank you very much indeed.
Right, we're keeping ourselves generally on time, which is very, very encouraging. Our next speaker, again, is part of our associate faculty. Dr. Mary Collins is the Head of Talent Development and Learning for Deloitte Ireland. Has been working in the organisational development and talent management field over the last 14 years. And before joining Deloitte, she had work in other OD roles, particularly in telecoms. Mary completed her professional doctorate programme in Dublin City University in 2010. Her research focus was on looking at enhancing the psychological contract with Generation Y in the professional service sector to enhance performance and engagement at all levels of staff. Mary is currently co-authoring a book due to be published shortly with the Institute of Chartered Accountants titled Managing Smart People, Other Professionals, and we wish her every success with that. Mary today is going to talk to something that I'm particularly interested in, is how do we actually manage Generation Y? Mary, again, you're most welcome. I look forward to talking to you more about that.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm really delighted to be here today. It's a very momentous occasion indeed, and I'd like to speak to you about Generation Y. As Dermot said, I currently work as the Head of Talent Development for Deloitte here in Ireland, and 80% of our employees are under 35 years of age. 80%. So it started to fascinate me. I was doing a lot of career profiling work when I joined the firm 6 years ago. And what I started noticing was these young employees were scoring really high on pure challenge. So they wanted really challenging roles, but they were equally scoring high on work-life balance. And they're quite uncomfortable bedfellows, actually. You want really challenging career, but yet you want to have a very good balance in your life. So it sparked an interest in me, and I went on to do my doctoral research in this area, where where over 500 of this population participated in my study. So it was a range of surveys, focus groups, and quite a number of in-depth interviews. So I just wanted to give you a whirlwind tour really of my research and an insight into this generation. This is the cover of Time magazine from earlier this summer. And it's the me generation. Millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents, and why they'll save us all. And I think this really encompasses a lot of some of the trends I'm going to discuss with you today. There has been a real surge of interest in this area, and I'm delighted Dermot is interested anyway, hopefully the rest of you are also, because Generation Y are an ever-increasing part of our workforce. And we need to look at how can we get this generation engaged and performing at a really high level and really enjoying their work also. So just to take a step back and have a look at the intergenerational workforce, which I presume most of us in this room are a part of. So we have the baby boomers. Again, 87% of CEOs currently are in this cohort. And baby boomers would value tradition, tenure is very important, status. The job for life would be a key aspect of the baby boomer employee. Then we look at Generation X, and typically Generation X, very competitive. We're noticing a lot of trends in the research around ambition. If you think back to the whole yuppie era, Generation X would have been a part of that. And a very sad trend, I think, the concept of the latchkey kids. And hands up, I am part of Generation X. I won't ask you to identify what quadrant you're all in. Clearly, most of you were born post-1980, so... but Generation X, I suppose when you think about the parenting, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but they were brought up in, you know, that long hours culture, often having to fend for themselves, and typically now they're quite an independent cohort in the workplace. And then we come to Generation Y, who, and this is not to stereotype, but there are very consistent trends we're seeing in the research around the different generations. Obviously not everybody is going to fit into the trends, but Generation Y are quite a fascinating group, and I'll talk a little bit more about the trends we've noticed in a moment. Generation Z are really, they're in their early teens at the moment. We haven't seen, obviously, what they're like in the workplace. One thing we are noticing, and there's a lot of current research around how they're going to behave socially, because they are very reliant on technology, and that's going to be an ever-increasing area of research. So when we look at this Generation Y population, they are typically, Martin has done a lot of research in this area, and the research varies, but it's roughly born between 1978 and 80, up to 1998. So they're broadly that 20-somethings cohort in the workplace at the moment. They're described as independent entrepreneurial thinkers who relish responsibility, thrive on challenge, love freedom, and hate micromanagement. Some of their defining moments, quite timely when we think of the week that's in it, but the 9/11 attacks had a profound impact. The emerging economies, globalization, very socially responsible cohort. They're digital natives. Us Gen Xers in the room, we're digital immigrants. During our lifetime, we actually, technology, do you remember the days when there was no mobile phones, for example? How did we survive? Whereas these guys, they're the Google generation. Everything is instant. So how has that impacted them? I just picked a few sound bites, and I thought some of these were quite interesting. If you want to just have a quick read. If we don't like a job, we quit, because the worst thing that can happen is that we move back home and there's no stigma. I took her to Montessori and now I'm here for her first day of work. We have never had more calls from parents to the HR department in my organisation. Parents ring us regularly. My daughter's working far too many hours. And or we have people ringing, coming to interviews with their children. It's quite amazing. It is quite amazing the amount of parental involvement we find in the workplace. I want to do good work, not just slog through the years till I get my Persian rug and my 50-gallon fish tank. So, interestingly, I know Ciaran's going to speak to us about values, and I'm very interested in that presentation. What we've noticed about Generation Y, they're connected 24/7, very self-confident, very optimistic, bored by routine. They're the most educated generation we have in the workplace. They're very lifestyle centred. So work is just one aspect of their life, and they're not willing to give up their life for work. It's interesting, I work in a partnership environment where the goal was always to become a partner. And now for the first time, I'm having very bright, ambitious guys and girls saying to me, you know what? It doesn't appeal to me. I don't want it. I want to have a life. I don't want to be on 24/7. I don't want the risk that's associated. Fine, you get the big bucks, but it doesn't align with my values. Very socially conscious, as I said. I was doing a graduate interview recently and I was asked, what do Deloitte do for the green agenda? Felt like I was being interviewed. So, it's very socially conscious and entrepreneurial. I want feedback and I want it now, often referred to as the now generation, particularly in terms of promotion. The concept of tenure and earning your stripes, that self-confidence has given a sense of entitlement. So why can't I be promoted to manager? I've been here 3 years. For the parents in the room, a key element when we talk about Generation Y and what has developed a lot of the behaviours, the helicopter parenting. So parents tend to hover over their offspring, intense involvement in the child's development. You're wonderful, you can be whatever you want. And I have an admission to make. It's quite an important day in our house. At 2:05 p.m. this afternoon, just before I left, my 11-month-old son took his first steps, and and of course I got the camcorder out, and in his book everything was being noted, and I just had to, catch myself saying, I really am doing the helicopter parenting piece, and you're wonderful, you can be whatever you want, and that has instilled an immense sense of self-confidence, which is very positive. But in the workplace, we're also seeing some of the implications of that. This is just an ad from a European law firm, which I thought really captured a lot of what the promotion around trying to attract this generation. Why wait? Responsibility from the word go. Briefly, Grattan from London Business School, Linda Grattan, has done quite a lot of research, and this is quite recent, and I thought it was interesting. The paradoxes. So Generation Y have a short-term focus, but they're equally committed. It's not that they don't want to work hard, but they will challenge how we work. Do we need to work Monday to Friday? If I want to log on with my laptop at midnight and work till 3 a.m., what's the problem with that? Tech savvy, but value the face-to-face. So clearly, technology is really critical for them, but it augments the face-to-face communication. And particularly when we talk about career coaching, mentoring, performance conversations, feedback, they really want the face-to-face time. Time magazine have dubbed the generation the trophy generation, but that's not necessarily true. Generation Y do want recognition, but it has to be meaningful. It has to be meaningful. Thank you, Dermot, for the plug for the book. And again, I can't go into this in any detail, but my doctoral research will be published hopefully next month. And I go in detail to this framework I've developed around how to really engage and motivate this population for peak performance. And I've touched on some of this already: meaning and purpose in their work, challenge, timely, honest communication, interest in personal career path. And just to share with you, one of my interviewees, a very bright, ambitious young female engineer, had told me that she'd recently been to a conference in London and her line manager had invited her along. And that meant so much to her. She said the fact that her manager felt she could get a lot of value from this conference, and it actually impacted her career progression, and she decided to stay with that organisation. I interviewed her in 2009, and she contacted me last month to say she had just been appointed as a senior manager to that engineering organisation. Values and vision, critical. Attentive management, and that is spending the time with the individuals. Terms and conditions are important. This generation need to feel they're being paid fairly for the work they do. And energy management refers to the work-life blending, as we now read about it. So just to pick on a few, 2 minutes, great. Just to pick on a few practical strategies which perhaps you can consider in your own workplaces. Generation Y have tend to have a lot of challenges with Generation X in the workplace, even though they're closest in age. But that sort of Generation X will often look at the Yers and say, gosh, they're so lazy, or they're not really, there's no work ethic there. So there is a lot of conflict. Generation Y tend to prefer the baby boomers as their mentors. But they really value that peer-to-peer collaboration in the workplace. They want a fun workplace, so good luck with that. If you have budgets where you can have slides, and this is obviously Google, but that sense of how can you create fun and a social environment. In my own workplace, in my own research, it was interesting, that whole concept of going for drinks after work, they're not really that interested anymore. They want to have fun at work. They want work to be fun, as opposed to, doing fun stuff after work. And continuous feedback. I really like this graphic here. People are our greatest asset, blah, blah, blah. They're not going to fall for the rhetoric. They want meaningful feedback, instant gratification, and just-in-time feedback. If they're doing something well, tell them at the time. If they need to improve, they're hungry for development, tell them as well. So that informal feedback is so critical. So if I were to leave you with just one key strategy, Generation Y, they want to be heard. They want their voice to be heard in the organisation. And it's that face-to-face time. Spend time with them, invest energy and resources, and listen to them so they feel empowered. And the good news, Generation Y are the most high-maintenance workforce in the history of the world. But the good news is they are also going to be the most high-performing. So thank you very much for your time.
Mary, I really enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering, at the start you said that 80% were Generation Y in your population. And I'm wondering, did you look at, or did your research draw any conclusions around where Generation Y is in the minority in an organisation, maybe they're less than 20%, less than 10%, how do they get on with baby boomers and Generation X's?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there can be, there's huge opportunities there with that mixed generation workforce, but there's also huge challenges and frustrations for the Gen Yers, particularly around the hierarchy. And just to share another example, we had new graduates join us last year, and one of the guys, his laptop wouldn't work, so he went straight into the partner's office, and partners would be quite revered in the organisation, and he said, my laptop isn't working. And that sense of, that confidence that you can question and challenge hierarchy as well, I think does create a lot of dilemmas in the workplace. And it's important that there are strategies in place to deal with that intergenerational, the different cohorts. And different strategies are employed, because often the Gen Xers are putting strategies in place, but they're not meeting the needs of the Gen Yers. If that makes sense.
One more question? Let's see, I'll handle it. Yes, see.
Hi, Mary. Speaking simply from the X generation, there's a lot of resonance in terms of what you were saying about conflict.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, you presented almost like a celebration of the Y generation. And coming from the X generation, I'm thinking to myself, this bunch sound a bit like superficial, shallow, and self-centered. And I'm just wondering, is there any sort of research around sort of the negative implications? Because this could be almost like just all fall down at some point, in terms of the sustainability of people that I know in terms of society.
Absolutely. And there are significant disadvantages in the workplace, particularly around that sense of self-confidence and entitlement, and the sense that I deserve this, I deserve to be promoted, without actually being managed properly. So I think they need to be managed very, very carefully and coached and mentored. And it's back to Michael mentioned, the reality testing is really important. okay, you think you're ready to take on a managerial role, but let's get some feedback and let's, realistically, is it time for you? So that would be the main area, Steve, I think, is that sense of entitlement. Yeah.
And I say to Mary, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And finally, how does one introduce one's own boss? Professor Ciaran O'Boyle is the director of the Institute of Leadership at the RCSI. He's also professor of psychology. It was he, I think, along with some of his colleagues in the RCSI, who had the vision and wisdom to actually set up the Institute of Leadership, which is now being developed very nicely across many spectrums across the world. He established the first department of psychology in an Irish medical school back in 1985, and has been a visiting professor at the School of Dental Science at Trinity College, a Vice Dean of the RCSI, Faculty of Medicine, and a member of the RCSI Senior Management Team. I think before joining the RCSI, he was a Senior Research Psychologist at the UCD Department of Psychiatry at St James's Hospital. He holds a BSc, a PhD, both from UCD, a Diploma in Theology from Milltown, which you could do a whole evening on that alone, and then a Diploma in Organisational Leadership from University of Oxford. He lectures extensively around the world, both internationally and locally, and has published over 70 peer-reviewed papers, 2 books, and numerous book chapters. So you can see he's a very, very busy boss. He's been consultant psychologist to a range of national and international public and private sector organisations in both the military, aviation, and business and financial sectors. And Ciaran gets the task today to wrap up today's session talking about value-based leadership. Can I introduce my boss, Professor Ciaran O'Boyle.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dermot. I was really feeling very energetic and young until I heard Mary talking about Generation Y. I want to start with Mark Twain, because we're going to talk about leadership and values. Sometimes I wonder whether the world is being run by smart people who are putting us on, or by imbeciles who really mean it. And maybe to kind of bring that a little bit more alive for you, I just give you an example of the kind of person that we mean here. So what I'm going to take a fairly philosophical perspective on this. I'm not going to talk about leadership in healthcare. I'm going to talk about leadership in terms of where we're at the current stage in modern society, and what actually seems to be happening, and how I think things are possibly going badly wrong with modern society. Now, the importance of values for leaders is that even leaders who appear on the face of it to be doing pretty well, if the values don't chime with that, they can very quickly get into trouble and start to damage their reputation. And that's a slightly lighter side of that, but if you really want a perspective at the moment on this importance of leadership and values, and the values of leaders, we don't have to look very far. We don't have to look very far to see where this becomes really, really serious. And what got me thinking about this, I think Dermot got thinking about it at the same time. A couple of years ago, we were teaching in Rwanda. And as you know, in Rwanda in 1994, 800,000 people were massacred in 90 days by the Interahamwe, the youth militias. And if you go to Kigali, there's a genocide museum there, and that's just one of the photographs I took in there. And one of the amazing things about that got us thinking about this was that these guys were led. They were incredibly effectively led. This was planned for about 2 years. They were told who they were going to massacre. They were trained and they were led. So the leadership in terms of efficacy, in terms of output and so on, was incredibly effective. Morally, or in terms of the values that underpinned it, it was completely bankrupt. And we were leaving, Dermot and I were actually leaving that centre, and we had missed this room, which was the children's room. And one of the guides said, "Have you seen the children's room yet?" And these were pictures that were sent to the centre by people who had lost their children. So all these children are dead. All these children are massacred. So this issue of leadership and the values that underpin leadership is an extremely important one. And it's one that I think bears a lot of thought and bears a great deal of consideration. Now, things may not be actually going so well if you start to look around. This is a very famous Irish poet and theologian, John O'Donoghue, who unfortunately died recently at a very young age. He was only 52. And John has become very well known internationally. But here's something that John said a few years ago, just thinking about current society. He said, "These times are riven with anxiety and uncertainty. In the hearts of people, some natural ease has been broken. Our trust in the future has lost its innocence. We know that anything can happen. The traditional structures of shelter are shaking, their foundations revealed to be no longer stone but sand." And if you take the pulse of the time, that's probably true of what a lot of people think, that something is changing, and what may emerge from that may not in fact be a very positive kind of society. The former Czech president and playwright Václav Havel said this. He said, "The tragedy of modern man is not that he knows less and less about the meaning of his own life, but that it bothers him less and less." And Havel went on to say this. He said, "I think there are good reasons for suggesting that the modern age has ended. Today, many things indicate that we're going through a transitional period when it seems that something is on the way out and something else is painfully being born. It's as if something were crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else still indistinct were rising from the rubble." It's a pretty bleak view of current society and a pretty bleak view of what might be the future, although I think there are possible antidotes, and I'll say something about that. And Havel finally said, "Modern man must descend the spiral of his own absurdity to the lowest point, and only then can he look beyond it. It's obviously impossible to get around it, jump over it, or simply avoid it." So there are quite a number of people who are standing back and looking at the kind of society and the kind of community that's been created. Look at financial services meltdown in the last few years. Look at the state of many people in Ireland, for example, living in poverty and negative equity, lack of certainty, increased anxiety. You look at places, some of the places we work, where political instability is becoming the norm. So if you think about this in a business context, then this is a very interesting contribution from Klaus Schwab, who's the president of the Davos World Forum in 2004. He said, "In today's trust-starved climate, our market-driven system is under attack. Large parts of the population believe that business has become detached from society, that business interests are no longer aligned with societal interests. The only way to respond to this anti-business sentiment is for business to take the lead and reposition it clearly and convincingly as part of society, not something that preys on society." This is one of my very favourite philosophers, Otto Scharmer, who's working in IT, and I think Scharmer has some really interesting stuff to say. So if we say, if that's the situation and it's as bad as that, are there ways of actually doing something about that, of changing that, or of making it better? Scharmer says, "Regardless of the culture or sector we come from, we all share one characteristic, and that is we participate in large systems in which we collectively create results that nobody wants." Now think about a lot of healthcare systems, think a lot about financial systems, think about the defence industry, the international defence industry. We consume the equivalent of 1.5 planets to meet our current needs. 2.5 billion people live in poverty, and 3 times as many people die by suicide as through wars or murder. So if we're moving into a postmodernist, if we're in a postmodernist kind of world, it could be pretty grim. So the question then arises is, how do you start to engage with that, and how do you start to look at ways in which people charged with leadership, whether that's people at the top of organizations or people throughout leadership throughout the organization, can actually look at that? Well, I think one of the most interesting things that Scharmer has to say is this. He says, "Our major error is that we try to learn exclusively from the past that's finished, rather than from the future as it emerges." So one of the things that Scharmer is saying is this, that very often when we're looking for solutions to problems, we look to the past, and we try to repeat what we did in the past, whether it was successful or not. The problem with that is that the system has actually shifted into a different state. And a better way of thinking about this from a leadership perspective is to actually start to look to a future that's already emerging and try to actually lead for that future that's starting to emerge. And that puts a very different kind of metric and perhaps a more positive kind of look on this. So that brings me then to this idea of values-based leadership. And I just want to make a few points about this. That values are basically the guiding principles for individuals and organizations. That's what our values are. When they're declared and followed, they become the basis of trust, of motivation, and of commitment. There's some very good research emerging that businesses that take their values seriously outperform their competitors. So this isn't some kind of soft, wishy-washy kind of philosophy. That alignment of values and behaviour, and John talked earlier about behavioural integrity, about the alignment of behaviour with the culture of the organisation, that alignment of values and behaviour operates exponentially, not arithmetically. You don't get half or 0. You get, if the two things work together, 2 + 2 can equal 7 or 8 or 9. And when we think about strategy, strategy is largely concerned with mission and vision, but values are the foundation, or should be the foundation of strategy, in my view. Now, when we're working with people both on our master's programs, on our professional development programs, our short programs, and so on, very commonly professionals express in many different ways this sort of concern. I don't think I've got a pointer here, have I? If you look to the top left there, organizations will have a set of expressed values, and they will have a set of lived values. I'm showing that on the bottom right. And very often there's a gap between those, between what an organization says it does and what it actually does. And I think professionals see that gap very clearly, and it can be very frustrating to work with that gap because they end up what I call satisficing, doing well enough. But the same is true for us as individuals. So we have expressed values and we have lived values, and the question is, what's the gap between those two? From a leadership perspective, it seems to me probably the most important issue is what's the gap for people between their own lived values and the organization's lived values. And I think a very subtle form of professional stress, particularly in healthcare at the moment, is this gap between the personal values of very dedicated young doctors and nurses who want to do their best, who came into this as a service to provide service, a vocational dimension to it, and they are caught in a system which simply doesn't have the resources or the structures or the values to allow them to express that. And that's blaming people within the system doesn't get us very far. What we've actually got to do is look at the system itself and look at what the variables are within the system that can be changed. McGregor Burns, who most people here will have heard of before, anyone who's interested in management will know of him, he said, leaders embrace values, but values grip leaders. The stronger the value systems, the more strongly leaders can be empowered, and the more they can empower followers. I think it was very interesting just listening to Mary talking about the generation wires. This is important. The meaning is important. What's this about? Why are we doing this? What are the values of the organization? William O'Brien is the former CEO of one of the biggest insurance companies in the United States. Said the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. That's a very interesting statement if you unpack it. The success of the intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. What's the value system of the person who's actually intervening? And if we go back to what's happening in Syria at the moment, that's the kind of question that raises for me. And it's not all bad news. I mean, it's a very interesting movement in the US and in various other parts of the world towards philanthropy. This is Chuck Feeney, who's very close Irish connections, close to education here in Ireland, has given most of his fortune away at this stage, and Berkshire Hathaway and Gates and so on, they're giving it away. They want to give it all away before they die. So there are sort of very positive things on the highway. Now this is what they call a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go through it, but the reason I put it up here is it's my favorite example of strategy, of a strategy document on a single page, and it's from the University of Leeds. And what Leeds did, they spent a great deal of time on this, so much so that they now travel the world showing other organizations in the education sector how to do this. And if you look at the top there on the left-hand side, they have their vision, their purpose, which is our mission, their stakeholders, their key strategy themes, their strategic enablers, but look at the foundation. The foundation for their whole strategy, and this was deliberate, was based on their values. They surfaced their values and then they decided they would build everything from there up. So I think what that means is that there are ways in which organizations can operationalize things in a sense that floats the values or identifies the values and actually builds on the values. And that to me is very important. This is a report that the Hay Group in the UK did just last year, where they looked at the leadership challenges for 2030. It's a very, very interesting report. And they identified what they call 6 megatrends that are happening worldwide that will change the face of organizations, change the face of business. The global balance of power is shifting east. Climate change in all kinds of complex ways will become a really important problem. The war for talent rages on, that this is something that, this is where competition is going to be fiercest, particularly in knowledge economies. That accommodating to growing individualism, and it'd be interesting to hear about, what are the next group, the Zs, is it? The Z, yeah? Be interesting to hear about more about that. Embracing the digital natives is going to become extremely important, and they're different. And then finally, harnessing technology to innovate. These are 6 megatrends. So they asked the question then, if that's the case, what kind of leaders are we going to need by the time we get to 2030? And here's their summary of this. That the leaders of the future will need to be adept conceptual and strategic thinkers, have deep integrity and intellectual openness, find new ways to create loyalty, lead increasingly diverse and independent teams over which they may not always have direct authority, relinquish their own power in favour of collaborative approaches inside and outside the organisation. That's an interesting summary. But right in the heart of that, it's interesting to see the term integrity, which again is based on values. Okay, finally, the touchstone for me for all of this kind of thinking, and we keep on and on and on coming back to it, or I do, is this book, and I'd recommend it to you. Many of you will have read it and will recognize it. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. As Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camp, Auschwitz, wrote this book soon after he was released. And he said that what he noticed in the concentration camps is that the people that survived are those who were able to create some sense of meaning out of what was happening to them. And his kind of core idea was that if there's anything that characterizes human beings, it is that we are essentially meaning-creating creatures. That's what we're about, creating meaning. And it seems to me that what's very important for organizations in that context is that a value system must exist within an organization that actually allows for the creation of meaning. And my final slide, if I just broaden that out to take in a broader perspective, a universal perspective. This is my favorite quote from Albert Einstein. He said, a human being is a part of the whole called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself or herself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for the few persons nearest to us. An illusion. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such achievement is in itself a part of the liberation and a foundation for inner security. It's not necessarily the end point that's important, it's the journey to getting there. Thank you very much.
We're going to finish at 5:30, so I have a few questions for Ciaran before we want to wrap this up. Any questions or challenges?
I'll only take questions.
Yes, please. Here.
It was fascinating. I very enjoyed that. There was one point that really in the conclusion of the Hay report, it says that leaders of the future will have integrity. But from the earlier slides, we've seen that there's quite a few leaders in the world today who don't. And do you think is this more wishful fulfillment on the part of the Hay group, that these leaders maybe we want them to have integrity, but do we have any guarantee that that's going to be the case?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it probably is an issue of the way they've put it semantically in the report. I think what they mean is the effective leaders will have, and those who don't won't be effective. I think that's essentially what they mean. Whether those kinds of leaders are going to emerge, I don't know. And the other thing I think where the Hay report maybe hasn't quite got it right is that the focus is very much on a model of leadership, which is leadership from the top, rather than distributed leadership that works throughout organizations, which is the kind of leadership that we're more interested in. In fact, the NHS published, the King's Fund published a report for the NHS last year, leadership in the NHS, no more heroes. So, that kind of leadership is not really the leadership that we need in complex systems.
Another question, Mary?
Ciaran, what do you think that leadership will look like in cyber domains? Say, from an organizational point of view, how do you look at real world traits of leadership, and then how do you execute those?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Mary, and I think we don't know. I think it's something we're going to have to go and look at, because just as you were saying, we don't know whether the kind of psychological variables and the constructs that we currently use to explain behaviour will actually work on cyber behaviour. I think exactly the same is true here. So, with globalization, increasingly leadership is probably something that's going to be, operate through cyberspace, with distributed teams and so on. So, I don't think anybody knows at this stage how that's going to affect it. But I think it's something that we should look at. Yeah.
And lastly, are there some other questions? No. Are there any pressing questions for the other members of the panel today before we close? If not, I'll say just a few words. First of all, can I say thank you very much. We have a most interesting audience, because we've everybody from students right up to heads of organizations sitting in the audience. Plus we have a whole delegation from Jordan, so we're delighted you're here to join us for the gathering. I think in reality we had very little time to do an awful lot. I hope we gave you a sense of what digital leadership is all about. It's about creating awareness of key principles of leadership today, and also introducing to your area of cyberpsychology. And so I think within John we saw a practical, hands-on leader to this, how he actually does it at the coalface day today. We talked about the new world of cyberpsychology, which for all of us is going to be fascinating, and we look forward to working with Mary very closely, and has going to affect how we lead in the future, certainly. And then looking at the whole area of Michael's area of resilience, is a skill some of us we already have in spades, but certainly it's a skill we see within our junior doctor profession. We need it badly and quickly. And then talking about Generation Y, I think there's some huge challenges ahead of us as managers in this room. And so summarising to my boss himself, I think here puts everything in perspective. And it is a journey. It is a journey we're going on, and it's a journey hopefully that every morning you'll find one that you enjoy and make the most of the day. And thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure having this afternoon. It's been Friday the 13th, without no major disaster. So we'd like to welcome you to join us for some reception for drinks. I'm not quite sure if there's drinks upstairs in the corner. We'll find out. I think maybe back in the... Is that back? Exam. Thank you all very much.